Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture of concurrency control. Now in the previous video we have learned about how the concurrency controller can ensure consistency and how can it improve the concurrency of the schedules. Now we have learned about the binary locking system and we have seen that in binary locking system though it improves the consistency but it suffers from the concurrency, suffers from a low level of concurrency. To remove the disadvantage of the binary locking, we have used the shared locking and exclusive locking, and we have also seen that the shared locking and exclusive locking can lead to inconsistency in the database. So the way out is to use the two-phase locking protocol. Now, as you remember, in case of shared and exclusive locking, the problem was therefore the immediate unlocking of the data items. Now, two-phase locking does not allow that thing. In two-phase locking, locking and unlocking will be done in two phases. The growing phase, we acquires all the log, and in sinking phase, we release all the logs. So in the schedule 4, what we are doing, we are acquiring the logs in the in case of transaction 1 we are acquiring the logs in the growing phase. So our growing phase will be up to this one. This is the point where the last locking has been done. Now my shrinking phase will be these two instructions. Similarly, for the transaction 2, my growing phase will be this part of my growing phase will be this part of the transaction, and my shrinking phase will be this part of the transaction. So this is my growing phase, this is my shrinking phase. And for transaction 2, this is my growing phase and this is my shrinking phase. The point where we acquired the last lock is called the locking point. So this is my locking point of the transaction 1 and this is my locking point of the transaction 2. So by diagram, if you see the diagram, then growing phase we are acquiring the logs, so we are growing the numbers of log, and this is my locking point. The locking point is the point where we acquire the last lock of any data item. Now after that we can perform the operations in the transaction, and then when we start releasing the log, then we start the shrinking phase. So in two-phase locking protocol, there are two phases: growing phase where we acquire the shared log, where we acquire the exclusive log, and we can upgrade a shared log to exclusive log. We know that the shared log will be used when we want to read the data only. Exclusive log will be used when we want to read or write the data. And if in the transaction from we can improve the shared log to exclusive log in case of growing phase. Now in case of shrinking phase, we can release the shared log, we can release the exclusive log, and exclusive log can be downgraded to shared log. So upgradation of shared log to exclusive will be done in the growing phase, and downgradation of exclusive to shared log will be done in the shrinking phase. So this is the same diagram we have used in the previous slide. Now there are several types of two-phase locking protocol. The first is the basic 2PL or basic two-phase locking protocol, where it ensures high level of concurrency. It also ensures the conflict serializability of the schedules, but it can have cascading rollback, and it may suffer from deadlock and starvation. We are going to explain all the points in details. Now the second type of two-phase locking is conservative 2PL. In this case, we obtain all the logs, then start the transaction. So if we want to perform any operation of data item A, B, C or D, whatever the point we are going to use them in the transaction, we are going to acquire all the logs on the data item first, then we can start all other operation in the data item. It avoids deadlock because it is acquiring all the logs of the data item, so no other transaction can be interleaved until and unless we have started unlocking them. But it suffers from low level of concurrency, and the problem is requirement of lock which will be taken that will be known beforehand, and which may be a problem in real life. The next type of 2PL can be strict 2PL. Here, what we are going to do, we are going to release all the exclusive lock only after the commit statement. So, when the transaction has committed its operations, that time only we can release the exclusive lock. The shared lock can be released before commit. It deals with cascading rollback, and how it is dealing with cascading rollback that will be clear to you later, but it may suffer from deadlock and starvation. The next kind of 2PL is rigorous 2PL, where all the exclusive and shared lock are released after the commit. In strict, we are only releasing the exclusive lock after the commit, but in case of rigorous 2PL, we are releasing exclusive as well as shared lock after the commit. It deals with cascading rollback but may suffer from the deadlock and the starvation. And in this case, the concurrency is very low because we are holding all the data until and unless the transaction is over. So let us take some example of all the four types of two-phase locking. Then we are going to explain the problems with each other. So schedule 5, here we can see that schedule 5 we have mentioned it as basic 2PL. So if it is basic 2PL means there will be a growing phase for each and every transaction, and there will be a sinking phase for each and every transaction. For transaction 1, this will be my growing phase and this instruction is my locking point because we are acquiring the last lock in this position. From this to this is my sinking phase because we are releasing the lock from this position. For transaction 2 in schedule 5, from this to this is my growing phase and this is my locking point, and from this is my shrinking phase because we are unlocking the data item here. But it may suffer from deadlock and it may suffer from cascading rollback. Why it may suffer from cascading rollback? You can see that if transaction 1 start, then transaction 1 will perform all the operations up to this. Then the transaction 2 can start. Now, if the transaction 2 start after this point, then the transaction 2 is reading a data which is written by the transaction 1. So, we are having a dirty read problem because transaction 1 has not been committed, but the transaction 2 is reading a data which is written by the transaction 2. As there is a dirty read problem, we know that in a schedule, if there is a dirty read problem, then it will suffer from cascading rollback. Why I am saying so? Because if the transaction 2 fails, transaction 1 fails at this position, then the transaction 1 need to be rolled back, as well as the transaction 2 is reading the data, then transaction 2 is also need to be rolled back. So schedule 5 may suffer from the cascading rollback. In case of schedule 6, which I have mentioned as conservative 2PL, what in the conservative 2PL, what we are going to do, we are going to acquire all the lock at the beginning of the transaction. We may release the lock at the sinking phase at any position, but the growing phase will be finished before any other read-write operation can start in case of conservative 2PL. So you can see that we need the lock on data item A and B, so we acquire all the lock. Similarly, in case of transaction 2, we are acquiring all the locks. Now we are releasing the lock. So this is my sinking phase for the transaction 1 and this is my sinking phase for the transaction 2. Here this instruction is the locking point for the transaction 1 and this instruction is the locking point for the transaction 2. As it acquiring all the logs before starting of the any other operation in the transaction, so it directly ensures that there will be no deadlocking. Now schedule 7 is my conservative 2PL. In conservative 2PL, we know that all the exclusive lock will be released after the commit operation. Now, when we acquire an exclusive lock on a data item, we want to perform a write operation on the data item. So, as we are not releasing any of the data exclusive lock from the data items where we have performed the write operation, there is no chance of dirty read. As there is no chance of dirty read, then the conservative 2PL ensures that the schedule will be a cascade schedule. So here my growing phase is from this point to this point. This is the locking point, and my sinking phase will be this to this. In case of transaction 2, my growing phase will be from this point to this point, and this will be my locking point, and my sinking phase will be this. Now, in case of rigorous 2PL, we know that all the unlocking will be done after the commit statement. Obviously, it is a subset of the conservative 2PL, and as conservative 2PL ensures that schedule will be a cascadeless schedule, then the rigorous 2PL should be a cascadeless schedule. So here the transaction 1 is growing phase is from this to this point, and this is the locking point, and the sinking phase will be this and this, these two operations. Now in case of schedule 2, the growing phase will be this to this with the locking point at lock SB, and as we know that in case of rigorous 2PL, all the locks should be released after the commit instruction, so our syncing phase will be after the commit instruction. So the difference between the conservative and the rigorous 2PL is in this part. Next, we are going to discuss about the lock manager. So what is a lock manager? Lock manager actually manages all the locks. It is basically a hash table, and we know that hash table is a content addressable table. Content addressable table means depending on the content, it will be placed in any of the open cell, in any of the empty cell of the table. So lock manager is basically a hash table. The name of the data items are used for hashing index. So using the name of the data item, if we go for this diagram, so this 5, this 47, this 167 are the name of the data item. So depending on the name of the data item, it will be mapped to any of the empty cells of the hash table. Each of the data item has a linked list associated with it. So all the data items will have a linked list, and that linked list is actually says me what type of locking it is there. Every node in the linked list represents the transaction which requested for lock. So here we can see that T43 has requested for the lock on the data item 5. Similarly, T27 has requested the lock for data item on 47, and T18 and T1 is requested lock on the data item 47. Mode of the lock requested, either it will be shared or exclusive. So the in this diagram the mode of the lock has not been mentioned. So it can be mentioned like this. So if I mention S, so it means that the transaction 43, T43 has requested a lock, a shared lock on data item 5. Similarly, the T23 has requested a shared lock on the data item 167. So from the diagram, it may be by the color of the node, it may be clear to you what kind of locking it is requested on the data item. And it also tells you the current status of the requested, current status of the request. It is granted or it is waiting, that will be given. So in this diagram, the lighter green color will give me the granted and the darker green color will give me the waiting. Every new lock request will be added in the end of the linked list. So here, this is the linked list. A new lock request will be added after this as a node. So let us concentrate. The T27 has been granted the lock on the data item 47 as well as T18 has been granted the data item on the for data item 47. So as both of the transaction have granted lock, it cannot be exclusive. Similarly, it cannot be shared exclusive or exclusive shared. So the lock here need to be shared and shared, otherwise both of them cannot be granted. Similarly, transaction 1 is requested lock is in the waiting stage. As it is in the waiting stage, we can say that it will be exclusive lock. So T1 has requested a exclusive lock on the data item 47. So by this we can understand what kind of locking it is, which transaction has requested the lock, what kind of locking it is requested, and what is the current status of the lock. So this lock manager will be very much important in case of dealing the starvation. So we will going to discuss this in later. So let us discuss what is deadlock and starvation. Now, deadlock is a situation where a transaction Ti holds a data item and it requests another data item B. But another transaction Tj holds the data item B, which is required by the transaction I, and it requires the data item A to complete. Data item A is held by the transaction I. So neither of the transaction can complete its job because they are dependent on each other, and as they cannot complete their job, so it creates a deadlock in the schedule. So there are four necessary conditions for a deadlock to happen. One is the mutual exclusion. The second one is hold and wait. The third one is the no preemption, and the fourth one is circular wait. So hold and wait we have already discussed. Mutual exclusion means there is only one instance of the data item. Obviously, in this case, there is only one instance of data item A and data item B. And no preemption means no transaction can hamper the other transaction and complete its job. The starvation is the situation when a transaction has to wait for an indefinite period of time to acquire a lock on a data item, and means until and unless it acquires a lock on a data item, it cannot finish its job. So it needs to wait for an indefinite amount of time to complete its job. That situation is called the starvation. We are going to discuss the deadlock and the starvation in details. In the previous example, we have seen that the 2PL lock can suffer from the deadlocks and starvation. So how to deal with deadlock and the starvation in case of 2PL locking? There are several methods. The first one is the deadlock detection. So we need to detect the deadlock in the transactions. For that, we are going to use the wait for graph. What is a wait for graph? In wait for graph, you know that there are some nodes and there are some directed edges. Each and every transaction represents a node, and each and every directed edges actually represent the dependency between the transaction. So in this diagram, the Ti is dependent on Tj and Tj is dependent on Ti for some data item. Now, as you can see that there is a circular dependency means there is a cycle in the wait for graph, then we can conclude that there will be a deadlock. And the concurrency controller looks for cycle in the wait for graph. And if it have any cycle, then it will like to break the cycle by hampering any of the transaction. So it may stop the transaction Tj to be performed or it may stop the transaction Ti to be performed. Now in this way, by violating the condition of no preemption, the deadlock detection can be used to break the deadlock in the transactions. The second kind of deadlock handling technique is the deadlock prevention. Here, in case of 2PL, we are going to use mainly a timestamp based approach for deadlock prevention. Timestamp based approach is what each and every transaction Ti has is timestamp. It can be a token value or it may be the time, date and time when the transaction has started. Now there are two different approaches. One is non-preemptive, means no transaction can hamper other transaction. It is called the wait and die approach. The second one is a preemptive approach when a transaction going to hamper the other transaction, and it is called wait and wound approach. In both of the approaches, it compares the timestamp and it gives privilege to the older transaction. Now we are going to discuss about the wait and die approach in case of deadlock prevention. So we know that each and every transaction has its timestamp, and Ti represent the timestamp of transaction I, TSTI represent the timestamp of transaction I, and TSTJ represent the timestamp of transaction J. So TSTI less than TSTJ means Ti has started earlier, means it is the older transaction, and Tj is the younger transaction. If this condition satisfied and Tj holds the data required by the transaction I, means the younger transaction holds the data required by the older transaction, then the older transaction Ti will wait. Where it will wait? It will wait in
lock manager table.
till the younger transaction Tj frees the data. When the data is free, then the and then the Ti can start its work. Now, if the condition is true and Ti, that is the older transaction, holds the data required by the younger transaction Tj, then the younger transaction Tj dies, and Tj will die, and later it will start with the same timestamp. Here we are starting the Tj with same timestamp. So for the next time we are giving more privilege to the Tj because it will be the older transaction. It may be the older transaction, and by this way the wait and die approach will also ensures there is no starvation. The next approach is wait and wound. Here it is a preemptive approach, means one of the transaction is going to hamper the other transaction. And which transaction will hamper the other transaction? The older will hamper the younger transaction. So if this condition is true, means transaction I is the older transaction and Tj, the younger transaction, holds the data required by Ti, the older transaction, then the older transaction Ti wounds means hamper the transaction J, that is the younger transaction, and start its work. So Ti will start immediately and Tj will start later with the same timestamp. As it is starting with same timestamp, so there is no possibility of starvation in case of wait and wound approach. Now, if this condition is satisfied, means transaction Y is the older and Tj is the younger transaction, then Ti holds the data and Ti holds the data required by Tj, then the younger transaction Tj will wait in the lock manager table. When Ti frees the data, that time the Tj can start his work. Now, let us discuss how starvation can happen. Now we know that a starvation is a situation when a transaction is waiting to acquire a lock on data item and it is waiting for indefinite amount of time. Now this can happen due to a inefficient concurrency controller. Now why it can happen? To understand that, let us check the lock manager table. So in the lock table, let us take for the data item 167 another transaction. Suppose the transaction T2 is trying to get a exclusive lock. Now you can see that it is in for data item 167. Transaction T23 is already having a shared lock and transaction 13 is waiting for a lock to be granted, and as you know that it will be a exclusive lock. Now the transaction 2 is waiting for the exclusive lock to be granted on the same data item. Now what will happen over here is after T23 completes its job or unlock that item, the concurrency controller may give permission to T13 to perform its job. So T13 is now performing the job and T2 is waiting for the job to be performed. Now in the meantime, another transaction, suppose T3, is requesting exclusive lock on the same data item. Now after T13 unlock that data item, here the concurrency controller, instead of giving that permission to transaction 2, it gives the permission to or granted the lock to transaction 3. So transaction 2 will have to wait until and unless transaction 3 is completed its job. Now in the meanwhile, another transaction, suppose transaction 4, is requesting an exclusive lock on the data item 167. Now after transaction 3, the concurrency controller, what it will do, it will grant the lock to the transaction 4 for the data item 167. Once again, the T2 is not served. In this way, if T2 need to wait for indefinite amount of time due to the inefficiency of the concurrency controller, then we can say that T2 has moved to a state of starvation. Now, in this, so from this example, it may be clear to you that how a starvation can be there in case of a inefficient concurrency controller. In the next video, we are going to discuss about the timestamp based concurrency controller, where we are going to see that how the timestamp based concurrency controller can ensure the conflict serializability and it can ensure the non-deadlock situation. Till then, stay safe and see you in the next video.